Well, now to that shocking case of what's become known as catfishing, the use of online aliases to lure people into relationships. For more on this, I'm joined in Brisbane by Dr. Cassandra Cross, a senior lecturer in criminology at the Queensland University of Technology, who has researched online fraud for the last decade. And from Melbourne by Jan Marshall, the author of Romance Scam Survivor, based on her own experience with online fraud. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Jan, firstly to you, many people believe this could never happen to them, and it happened to you. Tell us about your story and how you felt after you realised that it was a scam.
Look, I, in good faith, went on to an online dating site and was approached fairly quickly by somebody who wooed me very strongly over some period, and after I had agreed to marry him, he asked me for some money for various bits and pieces over a period, and I gave to him, thinking it was a loan, over $260,000. That finished when he broke contact with me, and that's when I realised it was a scam. In that sort of situation, you go into shock, and it's a number of things happen. There's intense grief, there's intense disbelief, there is shame, there is decrease in self-worth, there is often isolation from friends and family, and it takes a significant amount of time to overcome the trauma of going through something like that.
And in your case, the scammer was after money. In the story that we're hearing today, that wasn't the case. So every case is quite different in this, aren't they?
Yes, they're very different. Sometimes they're after money. Sometimes they will spend a long time building up a relationship and only then ask for money. Sometimes they are doing money laundering, so they want to be able to move money. It's quite often a team of people and quite often located in West Africa, but not always. There are other places as well.
Dr. Cassandra Cross, is it a crime to be a catfish in Australia?
I think there are challenges in terms of deception and misrepresenting yourself online, and that's certainly one of the issues that many victims experience when they go online in good faith looking for a relationship, either on a dating website or on social media accounts. It's difficult to verify the genuine identity of a person, and in many cases offenders will take on the identity of a known person. In this case it was Lincoln Lewis. But it makes it very difficult for victims to be able to verify the authenticity of that person and lures them into a relationship with some tragic consequences, as we've seen today.
And in the case we saw today, I mean, the person was charged with stalking because of what happened because of that relationship, but not so much charged with the initial deception itself.
Yeah, so one of the unique aspects of today's story, I guess, is the fact that the offender is actually here in Australia. So far too often we see that the offenders who are perpetrating these deceptions are actually based overseas, and that makes it very difficult for law enforcement to be able to investigate, arrest and prosecute. But in this particular instance, the victim was here in Australia and has enabled the police and the prosecution to get a successful outcome.
Jan, you spoke earlier about the shame that victims feel. Does that mean actually many of them never come forward and we don't know the real numbers?
That's exactly right. I mean, you will get figures coming forward from the ACCC on people who report scams to either ACORN, the Australian Online Cyber Crime Reporting Network, or to ScamWatch. But, you know, it's a guess really. We estimate probably 10 to 12% of people might report, but we actually have no idea. But the figure is going to be much, much higher than the official reporting.
And Dr. Cross, we know these scammers are highly skilled individuals, although that often gets lost in the wash-up. People often look to the victim to see, you know, why they would fall prey to that. But just how skilled are they? What are the sophisticated things that they use to get their victims to believe them?
You're absolutely correct in terms of the focus being on the victim, and I guess in many instances the offender is invisible, so therefore it's difficult to lay blame on somebody that you can't see or that you can't identify. The case that we saw today, there are many techniques that the offender has used in terms of deceiving the victims into believing that she was Lincoln Lewis, through the use of photographs, through the use of actual Skype conversations, through using video imaging, to have a conversation with the victims. We see these techniques are being used by offenders to really try and authenticate the story and the ruse that they are presenting to victims.
Jan, what are the telltale signs that someone is being scammed?
Look, it's hard to know sometimes because initially it is the too early profession of interest, love, I think you're special, I think you're the one for me, I want to be with you forever. That sort of thing is very strong initially. For those people who go on to dating sites, they will be lured off the sites into either email or phone conversations. But I'm seeing a lot of other forms of connection too. I've seen in the past month, I've seen connections come through where people have been approached on LinkedIn. I know people who've been approached when they've been playing Words with Friends. And a recent one that I came across was somebody who was doing some online language classes and was approached by somebody who presumably wanted to practice the language and built up a friendship from there. So that's the real danger. Is it's very difficult sometimes to know whether that friendship is real or not. They will have very, very plausible things to justify why they can't meet face to face, or why they pull out of a meet that they have arranged but then can't be there. And the plausibility is one of the incredibly strong things. Plausibility and building up an intimate relationship are the sort of key factors that make these scam or catfish type relationships successful. And
is there a catfish type, or is that actually hard to gauge given that you don't actually find out who's behind it in many cases?
I couldn't say there's a type at all. I know the ones who are wanting money, because there, the motivation is money. And it's often people who need the money. But in terms of a catfish where there's no money involved, it's really hard to know what the motivation is.
Dr. Cross, should being a catfish be a crime in and of itself in Australia, and what would the difficulties be with that?
I think that's an interesting question. I think we do have laws that do cover false representation and deception, and clearly today we've seen laws around stalking that have been effectively prosecuted. I think this is a bigger issue around how we represent ourselves online and how we interact in that virtual environment, and it speaks to the challenges both for individuals in trying to communicate and establish relationships, and also the challenges for law enforcement in terms of trying to investigate and prosecute. So in this particular circumstance, we saw the offender was able to manipulate and exploit the victims into sending intimate images, into really believing that there was a genuine relationship there, and mimicking many of the characteristics that we would come to expect in a genuine relationship. So I think I just reiterate a lot of what Jan has said in terms of the skill level of these offenders and the difficulty in having a particular type or characteristic in order to try and warn people against it.
And Jan, how do victims recover from this?
It's actually quite a difficult scenario. There is very, very little support around for scam victims in Australia or around the world, so they are often left on their own and having to deal with the intense grief, often in huge loss of financial capability, as well as because of the shame and blame that they may be feeling, they will cut off from friends and family. So it's very, very difficult. For myself, I know what really made a difference for me was when I realised that the scam was not personal. And very often we're made to think it's personal, it's a very intimate relationship. And I only realised it was not personal when I started to do the research on scamming and saw that the scripts that had been used with me were repeated time and time again on some of the websites which report scams. And also I found that the photos that were used with me when I did reverse Google searches on them came up on 10 different websites, all with different names and different stories to them. And that really made me realise that it was a scam. And it's only at that point that I could, face the fact that it was a scam. And it took me probably another several years through depression to get to the point where I actually came to the point of speaking out about what happened to me and started up my website. And only then did I start regaining back some of my self-respect and my ability to think I was worthwhile. Prior to that, I didn't. So it's a tough journey. And I'm just starting up a not-for-profit called Life After Scams to provide support to victims of all sorts of scams.
Jan Marshall, author of Romance Scam Survivor, and Dr. Cassandra Cross, a senior lecturer in criminology at the Queensland University of Technology. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.